Thanks a lot, Stan. Anyway, as Stan said, my name is Leslie Kean. I'm with a group called the Coalition for Freedom of Information. And in 2002, we started doing some work on this case. And I just want to commend Stan. I mean, one of the reasons my group decided to focus on this case, and we had a lot of resources to put into some UFO case, was because of all the incredible work that Stan had done for, since he was 16 years old on this case. And you just saw a little bit of that just now, but there's a lot more. He's just done an incredible job, so I want to commend him. I also just want to thank John Ventry, before I start, for hosting this conference, for setting it up, for being such a great organizer. And I just want to acknowledge him as well. So I'm going to try to keep track of time. So what I'm going to do is, anyway, I formed a group. I was cooperating in 2002 with a group that was initiated by the Sci-Fi Channel. Am I in the right distance from this microphone? You're okay? Okay. Okay, thanks. And I was invited as a journalist who had been covering the subject matter to spearhead a Freedom of Information Act effort that was going to put this channel, the Sci-Fi Channel, was going to put a lot of resources into some UFO case. We picked the Kecksburg case, and they formed this incredible team, very professional team of people. It was such a privilege for me to work with. Among them was a lawyer named Kean, who was this amazing attorney who had done a lot of work with Freedom of Information Act issues in the past. We had a research firm, a historical research firm that worked with us, a public relations firm called Podesta Mattoon, which was run by the brother of John Podesta. And this is the beginning. We launched the initiative at a press conference in 2002. This is just a picture of the group of us at the press conference, some Sci-Fi Channel executives, some of the research people, our attorney, and Ed Rothschild from Podesta Mattoon to stand warning there. The next shot is just a close-up of our attorney, Lee Helfrich. I just want to acknowledge her because she is basically, we ended up filing a lawsuit against NASA, which I'm going to tell you about. She is the reason we had success. She was just did phenomenal work trying to get documents on the Kecksberg case. And another amazing component of our work, the next slide shows John Podesta. He came on board. He is the former chief of staff of President Clinton. And he came on board with us in 2002 as a public supporter for the effort because he cares a great deal about government openness and people's right to information, and he's also curious about UFOs. And he's been sort of a public supporter of this initiative from the beginning. We've been really fortunate to have him because he's such a high-profile figure, very well connected, and he brought a lot of publicity to the case. It was at our first press conference that he made his famous statement that a lot of people may have seen on the internet or read. I think it's time to open the books on questions that have remained in the dark, on the question of government investigations of UFOs. It's time to find out what the truth really is that's out there. We ought to do it because it's right. We ought to do it because the American people, quite frankly, can handle the truth. And we ought to do it because it's the law. He's also a lawyer, by the way, and it was a very special statement, I think, coming from an official at his level, this statement. I'm going to talk about two components of this. One is we did some investigative work on the case. This is myself with other members of this group, and two, we ended up doing this lawsuit against NASA. And I just want to first touch base on the investigative part of it. We did four different things, I guess, mainly. These were all in 2002. And again, this was the support of the Sci-Fi Channel, who provided the resources for all of this work to happen. I conducted some important interviews with both, well, these are the four things. I guess you can just read them. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what happened with each one. As Stan mentioned, a lot of people have thought over the years that the Kecksburg object might be a Russian satellite. And that would have been Cosmos 96 was the name of that satellite. There was a man named James Oberg with NASA who had been touting that theory for many, many years. What I did was I contacted Nicholas Johnson. He was the foremost authority in the world on orbital debris and Russian spacecraft and all that kind of stuff. Incredible credentials. And he was with the NASA Johnson Space Center. And I want to show you, this is what the Cosmos 96 capsule looks like. Now, we did know already, I don't know, Stan, you mentioned this, at 3 a.m., or approximately at 3 a.m., the same day as the Kecksburg event, Cosmos 96 did come down over Canada. That we know through documentation. But Nicholas John, but a lot of people said, well, maybe part of it kept on going. Maybe part of it ended up in Kecksburg. So what Nicholas Johnson did was he got access through the Air Force Space Command of the actual orbital coordinates for Cosmos 96, was able to determine without a doubt that Cosmos 96 had not come down in Pennsylvania. If any part of it had kept going, he was able to plot where it would have been and when. And he made this statement, I'll show you on the next slide, that basically that it could not have landed in Pennsylvania. A very, very careful study he did with those coordinates. So that was good enough for me. I'm assuming that we had eliminated it at that point, that possibility. But another really interesting statement he made was the second one. If you can just go back to that again. That no man-made object from any country entered our atmosphere and landed on Pennsylvania on that day. And I thought that was really interesting. What he said was that any large objects were cataloged. Nothing could come into the atmosphere that was large and not be detected. If it was a small object, it would have burned up on re-entry. So I thought that was a really strong statement, suggesting, of course, that if something did come down, which we all are pretty convinced that it did, it was not man-made. It was not from any country here. And so that was a very provocative statement, which I found really interesting. We also know, of course, the Cosmos 96, the capsule was only 3 feet. None of the descriptions fit the descriptions of the Kecksberg object anyway, but this was the definitive elimination of that possibility. The second thing we did was we looked at the trees on the, if you want to stay there for a second. As Stan mentioned, he showed one picture of tree damage. Trees were damaged at the site, which had been documented at the time by witnesses. And later on, Stan went down and took some photographs of tree damage. And he knew from witnesses that this was the same damage that had taken place right at the time that the object came down. There's one more picture. You can see the trees that are lying kind of horizontally. On this picture, that middle tree, the top was knocked off by something. That's not a natural thing. And you could sort of see somewhat of a trajectory of places where the trees were damaged. So we brought down 2 scientists from the University of West Virginia. One of them was Stephen Kite, who was a geoarchaeologist. Another one, Ray Hicks, a professor of forestry. And there were 2 things that they learned which were pretty interesting. Stephen Kite looked at the Earth, and he was able to determine that nothing huge fell down in Kecksburg on that day. If it had been a meteorite, if it had been a satellite, something solid that had actually fallen, it would have made a huge impact crater in the area, which he would have been able to detect. And there was nothing to suggest that. He also said if somebody had tried to cover up a big impact crater, he would have found that evidence of that as well. So this again points to what we know, what witnesses told us, which was the fact that the object came down slowly and made turns. It did not suddenly fall out of the sky. It was a gradual descent. And his discovery about what the Earth looked like at the time, what it showed, that there was no big impact, fits what the witnesses have told us about the object. Ray Hicks, who was the forestry guy, he studied the trees. And what was interesting about his data was that he was able to determine that the damage certainly on one of the trees that we know was affected by the object coming down in terms of its, we're like 99% sure, that he was able to date the damage on that tree by looking at the growth rings. And he determined that the damage on the tree took place, he would date it back to 1966. Well, Kecksburg, the event happened in December of 65. So basically, he was able to date the damage at the time of the object's landing. So that was really, really important. He was extremely impressed by that at the time. He was also able to show in that picture, he was actually able to find these exact trees that are in these pictures and to study them. The one that was broken off, he was able to, it was too dead for there to be any growth rings in that tree, but this is just an interesting detail. The tree next to it, he was able to see that it suddenly had a growth spurt. And that would have been because it had more room to grow because this one tree had broken off. And that growth spurt in that other tree started around the same time, 1965, 66. So he also looked at samples of other trees that were not damaged and, of course, didn't see the same damage as he did in these, which would suggest that there wasn't some kind of ice storm or some natural phenomenon that was causing this. It was very selective. So the fact that there was physical evidence now dating back to the 1965, the time of this event, is very, very significant. So that was a really interesting development in the case. And the last thing I just want to mention before going on to the NASA lawsuit is that I was able to, through a private investigator, locate 4 men from the Air Force officers from the 62nd Radar Squadron, 662nd Radar Squadron in Oakdale, Pennsylvania. And as Stan mentioned, the Blue Book file stated that a 3-man team was sent out from Oakdale, Pennsylvania. Well, this is the base from which they were sent. And we were actually able to find 4 men who were involved with that process of either searching or were on the base that night. And I did interviews with all of them. And what was really interesting about it was the tremendous amount of contradiction and differences in stories that I got from these men who were all involved. For instance, one of them told me that he was in the search party. He went to the site. He went with a small, I think he said, with 3 other people. They searched the field where the thing had come down. They searched where it was supposed to come down. They had their flashlights. They spent a few hours, didn't find anything, and came home. But what was interesting was he said that there was absolutely no activity on the road or around the site of any military people, any civilians, any newspaper reporters. It was just like there was nothing happening. And we know for a fact that the place was swarming with people, and with army officers, and with jeeps, and all kinds of activity. Huge spotlights were being shined down into the area. So the fact that he said there was none of that going on is really, really odd. It makes you wonder if maybe they didn't go to the same place where the thing actually came down. There's all kinds of things we could try to figure out about why. But it doesn't sound like he was describing the same place as all the witnesses and all the newspaper reports are describing. Another guy said to me that he went to a barracks and there were only 2 guys that searched the field and they didn't find anything. Another guy insisted to me, he was on the base the whole night, that there was no search at all. He said, absolutely not. There was never a search conducted. And there were also 2 guys that both claimed they were Project Blue Book liaisons, and the records say that one guy called. The Blue Book says that one of them called into the headquarters, but he claims he never called into the headquarters. So I don't really know. This was a whole mishmash of confusing stories. None of them corroborated each other. And we can all just make of that what we will, but I think it's sort of an interesting thing that either their memories are all mixed up, or they don't want to tell us what happened, or who knows what. But it's just odd to me that there wasn't more clarity, because this event was a big deal. It's the kind of thing you'd think people would remember pretty well. So that's just sort of a mystery. So anyway, while we were conducting these various investigations in 2003, we were also working on our Freedom of Information Act effort, and we launched this initiative and sent requests to many different branches of government, and we ended up really pursuing NASA. I don't know what the next slide is. Okay, well, we'll just leave it there for a minute. We sent a request to NASA along with many other agencies. We were looking for information for documents that would have pertained to the Kecksberg case. And we had some very specific documents and search terms that we made to NASA. One of them was for the fragology files, which some of you may, Stan has done a lot of research on these files. This was a list of the inventory. These are called SF-135 forms. They're basically inventory lists of files, and this deals with the collection space debris that's been collected and analyzed. It's a very important file. It's during the years that include 1965. And Stan had been trying to get this document for many years, and there's a lot of complicated things that happened around it. But this was one of the things we were requesting. So we filed off our request to NASA, and they wrote back and told us that they had no documents that were relevant to the request that we were making. And what was really sort of this really was sort of opened a door for us to really pursue this, because all 4 requests that we made, we already had documents that were relevant to the request that had come from NASA. So we knew that they had the documents we were requesting, but they were telling us they didn't have them. So we had black and white evidence that they were not telling us the truth. And because of this, we filed an appeal, and we won this appeal because we went back to NASA and said, well, you said you don't have any records, but here they are. We got these from your files already. Here they are. And they had to apologize and say, okay, and they promised they would do us an expedited search for us. They would be a very fast search, do a really great job, and they would do all the stuff for us, and they were very kind of trying to be very accommodating. And anyway, I just put the fragology files up there because they were one of the things we most wanted to find out information about because of their relevance. And one thing that's interesting is that they say on the right there, it says still at the Federal Records Center in 1994. Actually, there were but actually we were told, as others were told, that they had been missing since 1987. So there's a whole lot of confusion around the fragology files. We were hoping that maybe something would clarify itself. So anyway, what happened is this expedited search from NASA, we waited 10 months and absolutely nothing happened. They didn't come up with anything. So that's when we went and did a press release, a press conference again, and announced we were going to be filing a lawsuit against NASA. And my attorney had been working really hard in communicating with them, and we weren't getting anywhere. Can you put the next image on? I don't know what it is. Can you go to the next one? Oh yeah, well this is the 40th anniversary. Okay, so anyway, we have this lawsuit underway against NASA because that we knew that they had information that they were not releasing, basically. So we had a strong case. And there was lots of back and forth with the courts. Still haven't received anything relevant. And 2 years later, we were celebrating the 40th anniversary of the Kecksburg incident here. I'm just going to sort of give you a few highlights here. We were celebrating the 40th anniversary here with Stan at the Kecksburg Firehouse. I don't know if any of you might have even been there. Yeah, we had the object. They had cleaned up the object. That's myself and my attorney, Lee Helfrich, in front of the object, and my team came out for this, this event. And this was the first time my attorney got to meet the witnesses. And she was absolutely so moved by coming here, seeing the location, meeting the witnesses. It just really affected her and gave her a lot more inspiration to continue working. She didn't even know if she would ever be paid for work. This was all pro bono. We had some support from the Sci-Fi Channel at the beginning, but that wasn't a long-term thing. So she was just totally dedicated to this. But what happened on the anniversary date, the AP did a story about our lawsuit. And they called up NASA for an interview. And the NASA spokesman by the name of David Stites told this AP reporter that the Kecksberg object was actually a Russian satellite, that NASA had retrieved it and boxed it, looked at it, boxed it up and put it away, and all the documents about this were lost. So here we were 2 years into a lawsuit against NASA because we had no information about what the Kecksberg object was, and suddenly this guy comes out and says it was a Russian satellite. This is after Nicholas Johnson, the most authoritative NASA official in the world, told me that it couldn't possibly be a Russian satellite, and it was also after the Air Force had told us that nothing came down in Kecksburg. So this was sort of like being in the twilight zone here. I mean, what was going on? And I tried very hard to get communications with this man, David Stites, to have him explain to me, first of all, if they had if he was telling the press that they boxed this thing up and that they had the fragments and so on, how did he know that if there were no documents about it? How did he know they had them? He said there was no records for it. I couldn't even get an answer to that question. I tried repeatedly to email him. He welcomed me to send his questions, and it was a long process, and he never responded to any of my questions. Years later, a reporter, and it was just maybe last year, finally got a hold of him, and he said he had been told by NASA that it was a Russian satellite, but it was not accurate. That was not accurate. But anyway, it was just sort of one of the many developments that happened. I mean, these freaky things would happen all the time, you could not figure out. It was like this chaotic situation with all these crazy communications going on. You didn't often know what was going on. That's just an example of one that really threw us for a loop. And let's see what the next thing is. This was just the story, and I'm just telling you, you can't probably read it. That's a copy of the AP story that has the quotes from David Stites about how they had this satellite all taken care of and boxed away. These spokespeople, I guess they'll just sort of say something. They'll ask somebody, and he'll say, "Oh yeah, I think that was a Russian satellite, wasn't it?" And then he'll go to the reporter and say, "Oh, it was a Russian satellite," without really realizing the implications of what he's saying. I assume something like that happened. So the next one. This is the judge. Finally, in 2007, I went to one of the final hearings. The hearings were going on and on and on because NASA kept trying to get the case dismissed. They would provide some documents, and then they would say, okay, we've done all we can, we've done our searches, we've fulfilled our obligations, time to dismiss the case. And we had to, Lee Helfrich had to keep filing all these extensive briefs showing how NASA was not telling the truth, it was playing games, and all documenting everything to the minute level. It was, eventually, I couldn't even keep up with all this stuff. It was so complicated. And finally, I went to a hearing in March of 2007, which was really like 4 years into the lawsuit. And this was our judge, Emmett Sullivan. He's a very famous judge in Washington. And it was so amazing to me to go to this hearing because he was absolutely furious with NASA and frustrated. He could barely contain himself, and he didn't contain himself. He was so frustrated and angry with NASA for the way they'd been behaving. And here he was admonishing this poor attorney in court. And there weren't a lot of people, but he was, and I say poor attorney because she was a new one who had just come on. It wasn't like she had done all the things he was mad at them for, but he was just going on and on about how heads should roll at NASA and how he's going to bring in the head of NASA into court to just, you know, how can the public have any faith in anything that NASA's doing, and how do we know that they're doing their job? And they keep coming up with all these searches, and we have no way of keeping track of what they're doing. And he was really outraged about them. And I've written some reports about all this stuff. If you want more information, I've got lots of the transcript of what Sullivan actually said on my website, and it's really wonderful to read it. So what he did was order us to settle with NASA, which we did in the fall. It took a long, long time, but we finally settled with NASA, you know, and it was really a victory for our side. The judge was clearly in support of our side. We still, by the way, we still haven't gotten any documents now. This is just what it took us to get to the point of having the court require that NASA provide these documents for us, which they did. Under court supervision, they were to require lots of documents. They were to declassify any that should have been declassified, and they were also to pay my attorney's legal fees, which also shows that the victory was really ours, even though we weren't allowed to call it that. We had to call it a settlement, technically. So the first step after the settlement was, if you want to go to the next slide, I got these giant notebooks from NASA that had 689 pages of these detailed SF-135 inventory lists of what files they had. It looked a lot like the fragology list. Thick things, if you want to go to the next slide, I can give you, these are the examples. This is an example of just one page. I had to go through every single line and decide which of the files on these lists we would want to ask for. Which ones might have something to do with Kecksburg. I can tell you it was the most tedious and boring process I've probably ever been involved with. I had to go through it more than once. There were lots of things I had to look up. I didn't know what a lot of the acronyms meant, what a lot of the terminology was. It was just a very, very long and tedious process. On the next slide is another example. NASA highlighted the files that they thought were relevant, that they planned to send me. This is an example of ones that they highlighted with their marker. And again, I had to go through every page and figure out, you know, look at the ones they had highlighted, but I was convinced that they probably didn't catch everything that was relevant, and I was actually right about that. The next slide shows, this is a list of the files. I mean, I found so many things they hadn't marked in there that we did want to ask for. This is just an example. It also shows you how complicated it was. Of some of the files that I wrote them a 5-page list of files that we wanted in addition to the ones that they had suggested sending us. You can see that some of these sound like they might be relevant to Kecksburg. I mean, all the terms were all the files were fairly vague. There was nothing, of course, that would say, you know, objects landing in Pennsylvania or anything really specific to Kecksburg. You had to just kind of hone in on areas that you thought might have something deeply buried, that might even just give us a clue. I mean, we didn't necessarily expect to get something that says, oh, this is what came down in Kecksburg, but we hoped that we might get a name or a clue or something suggestive of something that had happened there that we could follow up on. So this is just an example of the work I had to do and the kinds of things we asked for. Okay, so let's see, the next slide. So anyway, there was a long process. So I went back to them with my list, and then they searched over 300 boxes. It was a very long process. And the basic result, to summarize it for you, is in the next. the next slide sort of explains that. First of all, the biggest question is, was there anything about Kecksburg? And I think I got about 1,000 pages of documents from them. And Stan, if I forget anything, please jump in. Because Stan was deeply involved with this with me, every bit of it. I shared it all with him, so if I might be overlooking something, just jump in. But first of all, was there anything about Kecksburg? No. Not one piece of paper that had anything about, even relevant or suggestive of anything to do with Kecksburg was found. But there were a lot of interesting questions that were raised though, through this process. And hopefully more research can be done. One is the second point. There were lots of newspaper articles and just stories and reports about meteors and fireballs around the same period of time that NASA had collected. Now, the Kecksburg event was a huge news story. It was probably one of the biggest meteor fireball stories, in years and years, and it was covered all over the country in the newspapers. And there was not one news story about Kecksburg, even though there were stories about all these other very similar events. So that seemed a little odd and maybe suggested that the Kecksburg file might be somewhere else in another location or something. I don't know. We couldn't really explain that. We wanted policy or procedural manuals. That was one of the things we requested. We wanted to know what gave them the right to go into private property and remove objects. What were the policies that governed the activities of NASA at the time? NASA was very active at the time in collecting space debris and bringing it back and looking at it. And in this case, they were on private property, so we were hoping to find some kind of procedure manual, which must exist, but we didn't get any of that. And a lot of the other interesting thing was 20 boxes that I had requested were missing or had been destroyed. And some of them really seemed to be relevant to what we wanted, such as NASA-DoD relationships between that time period. And it was amazing how many things were gone. And of course, other potentially interesting things were gone, specific attachments were gone all over the place, where somebody references a photograph and it's not there. And this is the last one, these letters. There was a whole series of letters written in 1965 to NASA from people who had been witnesses to UFO events. Lots and lots of them, because NASA kept in its file every single reply it made to these people, which were just form letters. And they sent these letters on to Project Blue Book. They kept their form letter response to the person, and they kept the copy of their letter that they sent to Project Blue Book, but they didn't keep a copy of, or they weren't in file, of the actual witness letters, which would have been so fascinating, because somebody may have written them about Kecksburg. But those letters were not in the file. So, this is the kind of frustrating, inexplainable thing that would happen all the time during this process. We have no idea where those letters are or why they weren't there. We can go back and say, well, those letters should be there, and they can't come up with them, and that's the end of it. So, another interesting, I don't know, the thing with Paul Willis, there were 7 boxes missing. This is to give you an example of the complexity of this, that had been checked out by an individual named Paul Willis, who was an employee of NASA at the time. And he had also tried to get the fragology files that we were talking about at the time and hadn't been able to get them. But he checked out 7 boxes and never returned them. And I went to NASA and I said, well, here, we've got his name. He was an employee. Could you please find him and find out why he didn't return these boxes? Because these boxes are of great interest to us. They're very relevant to the search, and NASA's job was to supply us with the boxes we were asking for. But they said, well, since he was no longer an employee, it wasn't within their jurisdiction, or they were not required to try and find him. So here we have a NASA employee who just took these things and never returned them, and NASA wasn't willing to try and locate the guy and ask him where those boxes were. That's an example of files that we will never know. We'll never know what was in those boxes. And that guy was interested in the fragology file, so maybe there was something in those boxes that was relevant. And we'll never know. So anyway, I just wanted to sort of share with you the kind of complexity and frustration that was involved in doing this. And the next one, is another example of just, I don't even, it's just the complexity that we were allowed to do a final search in 2009, which was beyond the original search, in which they didn't find anything, and we racked our brains to try to figure out more things to ask them to do, more places to search. These are some examples. other boxes that they hadn't been able to find. We asked them to do special searches. And by the way, they did extensive searches for the frigology files. I mean, I think they did lots and lots of searches in lots of places, and I think one of the results of this investigation really is that we have to realize that we're never going to find those files, because I think that NASA worked really hard to try and find them. But this just sort of shows you an example of the complexity of the whole thing. And so by 2009, we were basically done. And so you might want to know what did these, so we didn't get anything in Kecksburg, what did these files tell us about? I've got a list in the next. These are some of the things that we did learn about from the files. And I don't think this whole thing was a waste of time. We got a lot of great historical information about the time period in the 1960s and NASA's activity. These are the subject matters that were really covered by the files that we got. And of course, you know, a lot of them were not interesting. Some of them were interesting. There were some UFO cases from the State Department files that were interesting. But, you know, 1,000 pages of stuff that was basically this kind of stuff. So, you know, I thought a lot about what we might have learned from this. Was this a valuable thing to do? I really think it was. I think that the one thing that was really positive in this, of course, it eliminates a lot of things, and it shows us what we need to do next. And it opens up a lot of new questions for us about the case. But I think what's also important is that this was an unprecedented victory. My attorney, who's an expert on the FOIA, said that never before has a civilian won a case against a government agency in federal court, a FOIA case, without the intervention of Congress. So this is the first time that such a victory occurred, and it happened to be about a UFO case. So just the fact that we had that accomplishment, it got lots of media coverage and lots of attention, I think is a very positive thing. You know, everybody involved took the case very seriously, including the judge. And John Podesta and a whole team of people that were brought together, and the media treated it very seriously. So I think overall, the attention that it got was really positive. But we did learn how the Freedom of Information Act needs to be reformed. It's obviously got all kinds of problems. We couldn't even get documents from an agency that we already knew they had. They still told us they didn't have them. And we had to get an attorney to get what was rightfully ours under the law. And nobody should have to do that. Most people obviously can't do that. So this highlights the problems that we all have living in a democracy, even though, of course, it's great we have the Freedom of Information Act, and we've received lots of very valuable stuff through that law. Nonetheless, there's lots of problems with it as well. And I think our adventures with this certainly highlight what the problems are and the reforms that we need to make. So that was a very important aspect of it as well. You know, why didn't we get any documents on Kecksburg? I think there's a lot of possibilities. One is that we didn't go to the right place. We went to lots of different places under NASA. NASA should have documents because it collected space objects at the time. But possibly they're just stashed somewhere that we didn't go to. Possibly they're filed under some kind of code word or name or search term that we weren't aware of. They might have done that to make them harder to access. I mean, the clerks that we worked with, all the people in the actual offices who were doing searches for us, were great people. They were all doing their best to try and find what we needed. It's not like any individual was trying to give us a hard time. They just were working within the offices that they were in. So, you know, they didn't find these documents. They would have liked to have found them, actually. So, you know, maybe they were somewhere else. Maybe they could still be classified. I mean, certainly this suggests that this case is highly sensitive. You know, if we did all this detailed searches and still weren't able to find one thing on it, not even a newspaper clipping, you know, it makes you wonder if it's all classified somewhere. But, you know, I think this effort has really raised a lot more question. It's pointed, the investigative work we've done has certainly pointed to confirm that the event happened. We've got the physical evidence. We know now it was not Cosmos 96, which makes it even more mysterious. And I don't know, is there anything else, Stan, about the lawsuit that you think I should mention? I don't even know how long I've been talking. We can, you know, there's a lot, you know, it's just a very complicated thing. I'd be happy to answer some questions, but let's go on to the next one. I just want to again commend John Podesta. This is a meeting I had with him, and you know, he was so interested in this NASA lawsuit. And I had this meeting with him in 2008 in which I brought in a lot of stuff, and you know, and I've sent him the reports that I've done on it. The final report I did is on my website, freedomofinfo.org, if anybody wants to read it. But, you know, he's just a really brilliant, very well-connected guy, and it was this relationship that I developed with him working on this case that I just want to mention. You know, I have a new book out, and I just wanted to mention that book because that's really been my focus in the last 3 years or so, since 2007. I've been doing this book. And John Podesta, if you want to go to the next slide, because of this relationship, he wrote a foreword to my new book. He's just a great advocate for this issue. He runs the Center for American Progress in Washington, D.C. right now. And I want everybody to know, you know, we're all out here, we have sightings, we don't know what to do, we're perplexed about why the government isn't giving us more information. There are people in very high places around the world who take the subject extremely seriously. And what I'm doing in my book is trying to bring them all forward. These high-level people have written their own pieces for all of us in their own words about their own activities, investigations, and witnessing of UFOs. And I've made this book for people like John Podesta. I've tried to bring forward the kinds of information that will convince somebody like him and other people in government, policymakers, scientists, the kind of information that I hope can really move this issue forward, and that will benefit all of us. And I just think it's important for everybody to know that there are high-level people that support all of us. And I just want to give you a little colorful slide thing here of some of the people that have written projects for my book. He's written a piece for the book. Major General de Brouwer, Wilfred de Brouwer from Belgium, who headed up a major investigation in Belgium. There was a wave of sightings in 1989-90, absolutely extraordinary case with a great photograph, drawings. He was the head of that investigation on behalf of the Belgian Air Force. Another general is from Brazil, General Pereira. Jose Pereira, he's a 4-star general, has also written a piece for this book, and he's documented an extraordinary case in Brazil that happened in '86. There are government documents that have been released about it in which radar captured the objects at the same time as the pilots saw them, and he's a very eloquent spokesperson. Another general is General Parviz Jafari of Iran, who many of you may be familiar with the 1976 Iranian case in which a pilot tried to shoot down a UFO. This was that man. He later became a general. He was an Air Force pilot then. He writes as telling us his own story about what happened when he was up there face to face with a UFO and projectiles were being sent out at his small aircraft, and he tried to shoot it down. And as some of you may know, his equipment was disabled each time he tried, just at the last minute, which is kind of an uncanny situation. And another general is General Denis Letty from France. He's the gentleman on the left. He was the initiator of the Cometa report in 1996, I believe. It was in the late 1990s, which got me started on this issue. 10 years ago, it was a French study of the UFO subject. The next slide shows me interviewing him. The point is that these are all generals, and they know what's going on, and they're all committed to trying to change the situation for us so that the U.S. government especially can start to play a more responsible role in helping the rest of the world, which has already gotten started, to try to solve this problem on an official level. What's the next? Okay, this is just, and there's some pilots also that have come forward in my book. This is a pilot from Portugal. His last name is Guerra. And he had an extraordinary event when he was an Air Force pilot. He now works for Portugalia Airlines. And another pilot from France. So anyway, I think that's it. I just wanted to give you a taste. That's Governor Phi Symington from Arizona, who was a witness to the Phoenix Lights in 1997 and didn't say anything about it for 10 years. And actually tried to spoof the whole thing when he was governor. I'm sure some of you are familiar with his story, and has now become an advocate for seeing policy change happen, and is just had an amazing transformation throughout from the time he saw the object in '97 till now. And he was actually governor at the time, so he's also somebody who has come forward. So anyway, I just want to give you a little taste of what the work I'm doing now is, and I don't know how much more time we have, but let's have a Q&A, and Stan can also join me if people want to talk about Kecksburg. Or Stan can just come up here and maybe there'll be questions that he can answer better than I can. Yeah. Why didn't they? You know what? We wish they would have, because that's a really good question, because under the law, if something is 25 years old, they're supposed to release it. But if they're not going to release it for national security reasons, they're supposed to tell us that. So therefore, if they wanted to withhold a document because they felt it was in the best interest of national security to withhold that document, they are required to write to the person who requested the information and make that statement. We cannot release this document due to national security concerns. And we would have been very happy if they had done that. We wish they had, because if they had, that would be an acknowledgement that there was something there was an event, there was something that they needed to keep off the record. And we haven't even gotten that, so we were hoping we might get such a letter. And they didn't do it, and it would have been to our benefit if they had, rather than just come up with nothing. You understand that it would just sort of be an acknowledgement that there was an issue there. So it's a good question. That's probably what they should have done, because we have to assume they do have documents somewhere, and that's probably what they should have done. And I wish they would, and still will, but hasn't happened.
Do you have any thoughts on why Kecksburg doesn't get nearly the publicity or notoriety that Roswell and Mexico?
I mean, I think in recent years it's been getting more. I mean, I think, the lawsuit got a lot of publicity, but let's let Stan's here on the ground with it.
I mean, in recent years we're getting a lot of international attention to it. There's a huge amount of interest in it worldwide, but I think it's probably because the Kecksburg, people in Kecksburg, the fire departments only recently began to have the Kecksburg Festival, but they're still not turning into a tourist type event like you have in Roswell, where you have thousands of people coming from all over the world out in the middle of the desert to come to this little beautiful little town out there in Roswell. So they really haven't really pushed it at a lot of levels, and the investigation's still going on. To a degree, I'm still getting information on the case. I mean, as recently as the last few weeks, since the Kecksburg Festival, I've had several more witnesses come forward and didn't talk to me about it before. But I think it's more the fact that the community out there has really not made this to a tourist type thing, at least right now, even though they're sitting on an event that's causing a huge amount of world attention, and there's a lot of interest in it, and but I think that's one of the reasons why.
And Roswell had bodies.
I was just going to say that too.
That could be a difference.
Right.
Bodies is a big deal.
Right, bodies is a big deal. Yeah. There's some other folks in
Yeah.
I was wondering how you can get involved, how you can get involved with
I mean, right now, we're not really doing any FOIA work, because, I'm basically sort of the figurehead for the group, and I've got other things going on right now. But I would be happy, maybe we could talk afterwards.
Yeah.
And there's also Grant Cameron is here. Is he still in the room? Who's an expert on dealing with the Freedom of Information Act. I mean, he's been doing all kinds of things, so he might be a good person to talk to as well. And maybe that would be the best thing, yeah. I'm familiar with the term, I'm not sure I remember what that means.
There was a ship that was commissioned by Howard Hughes that they had cover of going and mining the ocean for
fact that I've never gotten any responses where they've said,
Well, apparently it's that they don't even have to.
oh, they don't.
Right, like, is it like,
They have all the power. I mean, that's the thing. There's no oversight. There's no way to monitor these agencies. I mean, when NASA comes back and says they've searched such and such a box, you have no way of knowing whether they've really searched it. You know, you just have to take their word for it. And this is one of the really frustrating things. At one point, I tried to get them to let me come in and search some boxes myself. Because the other problem is when you don't know the case really well, there could be some tidbit on one of those documents that they couldn't possibly recognize as being important. That's the other thing. Remember they kept saying that? You know, we couldn't think of every single term that they could search. So, you know, and you just have to take their word on so many things. And it's just, you have no way of knowing how confident they are or not. You just get this letter.
What's happening also, NORAD is getting a lot of these UFO reports, and they don't fall under the Freedom of Information Act. That's not in the agency. So they send it to NORAD, and they don't have to respond.
Yeah. Excuse me?
On the right, on your book, you have the different generals. You have the different generals listed here on your book. And the city of Kecksburg. Who is the general in charge? Did you find out?
Well, that's again a question for Stan, but you know, in the Kecksburg case, we haven't gotten any military people. We tracked down those Air Force people that I was talking about that I interviewed, but we don't have any of the high-level people that have come forward. I guess we don't know who they are. Yeah.
Talk to that general.
I'd sure like to find that general. We tried to get information from the Army. I mean, that's the pertinent agency here, really, because as Stan said, all the witnesses reported seeing Army vehicles everywhere. Army's, you know, officers shooting and threatening people with guns. And we tried a lot to get information from the Army. Yeah, we never got anything. I mean, you remember when I sent very, very specific information, witness affidavits, newspaper articles, a piece by Bob Gaddy about how he'd run into all these Army officials. He was a newspaper reporter. This incredible wealth, and all the stuff from John Murphy's radio program, very specific information about Army being there. Sent that off to the Army. And they wrote back and said, we hadn't given them enough specific information for them to have even begin there to search for us. Remember that? Yeah. And they said it wasn't specific enough.
But I did multitudes of FOIA requests during the 80s to all these different agents, and we had some major searches going on, and absolutely nothing turned up.
Yeah, I mean, this is just really, it's mind-boggling. Why nothing has turned up, and yeah. We do. Yes.
Anybody ever served the other agencies that use government satellites around the
Yeah, there was a lot of things on whether I did FAA, Coast Guard.
Since I was working for some guy.
Yeah.
But you mean whether they may have reported something coming in? Yeah, I don't know.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's right. Yeah.
With that was, they speculated that was the reconnaissance of the ETs. They're trying to capture it.
There's a lot of theories, a lot of speculation out there. Yes.
Ms. Kean, I know you've had a lot of opportunity to research these topics in the United States and other countries. What do you think the difference is, or is there any difference between the amount of stonewalling you get here in the U.S. versus Brazil and the Netherlands and those other places where those big cases were so well researched and now are known about?
Well, of course, I've never filed FOIA requests in these other countries.
Is it necessary to do so?
Yeah, I mean, it's different in every country, and as probably a lot of people know, that many countries in the last 10 years have released their UFO files. I mean, a lot of countries are just releasing them, so people don't have to do that anymore. I suspect that the United States has got to be one of the harder places to get FOIA information. At least it was in this case. But and I also know that a lot of other countries, of course, have government agencies that actually deal with the UFO phenomenon as a research project. I mean, that's their sole That's what they do. So one of the things I do in my book is I talk about the differences between the American approach and the approach in other countries. But specifically to FOIA, I just don't know that much about how it is in other countries. But I can't believe it could be anything worse than what we had to deal with NASA here.
And the fact that many countries have released certain documents, just like here in the United States, that doesn't necessarily mean there isn't other high-level documents they're not releasing. We know, for example, when Project Blue Book declassified their reports, we know there are a tremendous number of reports that are not in those files. I mean, there were Air Force people that kept their logbooks of certain events, and they tried to find them, and they weren't in there. And the example is, we did mention is, one of the Air Force personnel who was at Kecksburg that was tracked down had done an official report on Kecksburg, which was sent in to Project Blue Book. Yet that report of his has never shown up anywhere. But the Blue Book file was declassified. So once again, where did his report go that has never turned up?
And he actually wrote an affidavit. He was one of the 4 radar 662nd radars that I interviewed. This gentleman, he'd written a handwritten report, and he also said someone else came along and typed it for him, and I actually spoke to the guy who typed the report. And both, these reports, as Stan said, were filed, and they've never turned up. And this guy wrote an affidavit for us, which my attorney worked on him with, and we sent it off again to try to find this report that he had written, and never had any success with that either.
Okay, I think we're at the time. I think John is. Take one more.
I don't know if you're familiar with John Greenwald Jr. He runs the blackball.com website, and I was listening to an interview with him, and he's been involved with trying to get FOIA documents for a long time, and he mentioned that he had some success trying to get service reports, the CIRBIS reports from NORAD, and they said that they didn't have anything responsive to his request. But he found out that those, through some kind of international agreement with Canada, those go to the Canadians as well, and he ended up using the Canadian equivalent of our Freedom of Information Act and getting a bunch of documents from it. Have you ever thought about, or...
I already filed it with Kean years ago, and nothing showed up on their end as well.
Nothing about Cosmos 96 either, right?
No.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I don't know anything about it, but I'll have to check out his website.
Yeah, I wasn't talking about Kecksburg in particular, but just documents in general may be more easy to obtain from that.
I mean, you could spend, 10 hours a day forever trying to get documents with the Freedom of Information Act. There's so much that one can do, and it's so time-consuming. We need so many people to do it, but John Greenwald has been really heroic in that.
Thank you, folks.
Thanks a lot.